Hello friends, I hope you will be fine there. This is Sajid Latif Khan and you are watching my channel Learning for All. And today I am going to talk about very important structure here in English language, and that is voices. Let's talk about the voices. An action of a subject in relation to an object is expressed in two ways. These two ways of expressing action of a subject are known as voices. We have two kinds of voices, active voice and the passive voice. For example, I play football. This is an active sentence. Football is played by me. It's a passive sentence. I eat a mango. It's an active sentence. A mango is eaten by me. The structure of the same sentences changes when expressed as active or passive voice, but meanings in both voices remain the same. We only have some structural changes when we convert active sentence into passive sentence, but in both of the cases, action is played by the subject. Let's more talk about the difference between active and passive voice. To understand the difference between active voice and passive voice, we need to focus on the shift of a subject and object. In active voice, the subject acts upon the object, and in passive voice, the object is acted upon by the subject. The meaning of the sentences in both cases remains the same. Only structural changes take place. For example, it's an active sentence in active voice. I drink milk. We have the subject, the main verb, and the object. While in passive voice sentence, for example, milk is drunk by me, we have the object in the beginning of the sentence, we have the helping verb, then the third form of the verb, and we use by and then me. Let's talk about some changes while converting active voice to passive voice. Sequence of the subject and object changes. In passive voice, verb always takes a third form. Helping verbs depend upon the tense of active sentence. We also add by after a verb. Pronouns in the active voice will change into passive form in the passive voice sentence. Let's talk about some basic rules for passivization. Rule number 1. The subject will shift to the place of object and object will take the place of subject. For example, I watched a movie. A movie is watched by me. Here in this sentence, I was the subject and a movie was the object. But when we converted active into passive sentence, a movie takes place the subject, and we used me in place of I in the end of the sentence. Rule number 2. Past participle or third form of the verb will be used as main verb in the passive voices for all tenses. No other form of the verb will be used as main verb. For example, we are enjoying the party. The party is enjoyed by us. Rule number 3. The word by is used after the main verb. For example, they cooked food. Food is cooked by them. Rule number 4. Sometimes subject may not be used in passive sentences, but a sentence gives a clear idea about the subject. For example, Kashmir issue was discussed in the meeting. Someone was killed in the market. Rule number 5. Auxiliary will be used in a passive voice sentences according to the tense in the active voice sentences. There are rules for each auxiliary verb. For example, I play tennis. It's a sentence with present tense and it's an active sentence. Tennis is played by me, and we have converted this active voice into the passive voice. I played tennis. It's a past tense. Tennis was played by me. Here you see that the auxiliary is going to be used as according to the tense that we have used within the active sentence. Let's talk about rules according to the different tenses. Active and passive rules for simple present tense. First of all, in this case, in active tense, in a present tense, we have subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we have first form of the verb. It depends upon the kind of verb that we are going to use. In an active sentence, it takes s or es in the end, then we use object. For example, he buys a car. Now we are going to change this into passive. Let's have a passive structure. We use object in the beginning of the sentence. We can use is, am, are depending on the form of verb that we have used in an active voice. Then we use third form of the verb. As I told you earlier on that when we convert active into passive, in passive sentence we always use third form of the verb. Then we use by and then the subject. For example, a car is bought by him. Let's talk about its negative sentence. We use subject, then do or does, plus not, then first form of the verb, and then the object. I do not write a letter. Let's talk about the structure of the passive sentence of it. We use object in the beginning, then we use is, am, or, depend upon the subject or maybe the verb. Then we use third form of the verb, and then by, and then in the end we use a subject. A letter is not written by me. It's a passive sentence. Let's talk about the interrogative sentence of present tense. We use does, then subject, then V1, first form of the verb, then the object. It depends whether we use does or do. It totally depends upon the subject. Does he take test? Now let's convert it into passive sentence and let's have its structure. We use is, am, are depending upon the subject, then we use object, then third form of the verb, then we use by and then subject. For example, is test taken by him? Now let's talk about the present continuous tense. We have structure for it, like we use subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we use is, am, are, then first form of the verb with ing and then object. Let's have an example of it. He is driving a car. Now I am going to talk about the passive structure of the present tense. We use object, then is, am, are, then being, then third form of the verb, then by and then the subject. For example, a car is being driven by him. Now let's talk about the negative sentences of present continuous tense. First we have the structure of active sentence. We use subject, then auxiliary verb, then not, then first form of the verb with ing and object. For example, he is not driving a car. Let's talk about the structure of passive sentence. We use object, then auxiliary verb, then not, then we use being, then third form of the verb, then we use by and the subject. For example, a car is not being driven by him. Interrogative sentences of present continuous tense. In active case, we use auxiliary verb, then the subject, then first form of the verb with ing plus object. For example, are they listening music? Let's talk about the passive structure of present continuous tense. We use auxiliary verb is, am, are in the beginning of the sentence, then we use object, being, third form of the verb, then we add by and then the subject. Is music being listened by them? Now let's talk about the present perfect tense. First we have active sentence. We use subject, then has or have, then third form of the verb, then the object. Let's have an example of it. She has bought a car. And let's talk about the passive structure of present perfect tense. First we use object, then has have, plus been, plus third form of the verb, then we use by, then subject. For example, a car has been bought by her. Now let's talk about the negative sentence of present perfect tense. We use subject plus has or have depend upon the subject, then we use not, then third form of the verb, and then the object. For example, Ali has not completed a task. Let's have a passive structure. We have the object, then has or have, then not, then been, and third form of the verb, and then by and subject. For example, a task has not been completed by Ali. And interrogative sentences. We use has or have depending upon the subject, then we use a subject, then third form of the verb, and then we use object. For example, has she cooked food? Now let's talk about the passive structure of present perfect tense. We use has or have depending upon the subject, then we use object, then been, then third form of the verb, and then the subject. Has food been cooked by her? Active and passive rules for past simple tense. First of all, we have subject, then second form of the verb, and then the object. For example, he killed a lion. Here you see we have used second form of the verb in an active sentence of the simple past tense. Now let's convert this active sentence into passive one. First we have the structure for it. We use object, then was and were. We can use both of them depending upon the subject or object. Then we use third form of the verb. We add by and then subject. For example, a lion was killed by him. Now let's talk about its negative sentences. We use subject, then did, then not, then first form of the verb, and then object. I did not play cricket. Let's talk about the passive structure of simple past tense. We use object, then was or were depending upon the object and the subject, plus not, then third form of the verb, and then subject. Cricket was not played by me. Interrogative sentences of simple past tense. We use did, then subject, first form of the verb, and then the object. For example, did I play cricket? Now let's have the passive sentence of simple past tense. We use was, then object, then third form of the verb, then we use by, and then the subject. Was cricket played by me? Now let's talk about the past continuous tense regarding active voice and passive voice. First of all, we have the active sentence of past continuous tense, and I'm going to talk about the structure of it. We use subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we have was, then first form of the verb with ing form, and then the object. Shakira was singing a song, and its passive structure will be we use object in the beginning of the sentence, then we use was, then being, third form of the verb with by and subject. Let's have an example of it. A song was being sung by Shakira. Now let's talk about the negative sentences. First of all, we have the structure of it. We use subject, then was, then not, then first form of the verb with ing form, and then we have object.
Sania was driving a car.
And the passive structure of this sentence will be we use object in the beginning of the sentence, then we use was, then not, and then we use being with third form of the verb, we add by and then the subject. A car was not being driven by Sania. Interrogative sentence. We use was, then subject, then first form of the verb with ing form, and then object. For example, was she reading a book? And let's talk about the passive structure. We use was in the beginning of the sentence, then we use object, then being with third form of the verb, then we add by and then the subject. For example, was a book being read by her? Active and passive voices rules for past perfect tense. First of all, we use subject, then had with third form of the verb and then object. For example, she had finished a task. Let's have a passive structure of past perfect tense. We use object in the beginning, then we use had, we also add been, then third form of the verb we add by and then subject. A task had been finished by her. Let's talk about its negative sentences. In negative case, we have subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we use had, then not with third form of the verb and then we use object. They had not broken the window. And let's talk about its passive structure. We use object in the beginning of the sentence, then we use had, then not, then been, then third form of the verb, then by and then the subject. For example, the window had not been broken by them. Interrogative sentences. In this case, we use had in the beginning of the sentence, then we use by, then third form of the verb and then the object. For example, had they built a wall? Let's have a passive structure of it. In passive case, we use had and object, then been, then third form of the verb, then we use by and then the object. For example, had a wall been built by them? Now, active and passive voice rules for future simple tense. For example, we have the subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we use will plus first form of the verb and then the object. Let's have an example of it. They will watch a movie. Now let's have its passive structure. We use object, then will plus be plus third form of the verb, then we use by and then the subject. For example, a movie will be watched by them. It's negative sentences. In negative case, we have subject plus will plus not plus first form of the verb, then object. For example, they will not paint a wall. And its passive structure will be, we use object, then will and not, we use be and then third form of the verb, we add by and also subject. For example, a wall will not be painted by them. Let's talk about its interrogative sentences. We use will, then the subject, then first form of the verb and then object. For example, will they attend the party? And let's talk about its passive structure. Will become in the beginning of the sentence, and after that we will use object, then be, then third form of the verb, then we use by and then the subject. For example, will the party be attended by them? Active and passive voices rules for future perfect tense. In this case, we use subject in the beginning of the sentence, then we have will plus have plus third form of the verb, then the object. Let's have an example of this structure. They will have brought a car. Let's talk about the passive structure of future perfect tense. We use object in the beginning of the sentence, then we use will, then have, then been, then third form of the verb, we also add by and then the subject. For example, a car will have been brought by them. Negative sentence. We use subject, then will, then have, then not, and after that we use third form of the verb and then object. For example, they will not have bought a new car. Let's have the passive structure of this sentence. we use object in the beginning, then we use will plus have, and after that we use not, then been, and we use third form of the verb always, and then subject. For example, a car will have not been bought by them. Interrogative sentences. In interrogative case, we use will in the beginning of the sentence, then we use subject, then have, then third form of the verb, and then the object. Let's have the sentence. Will they have bought a car? And let's talk about the passive structure. We use will in the beginning of the sentence, then we use object, then have, then been, then third form of the verb with by and subject. For example, will a car have been bought by them? And this was all about active and the passive voice. You see, dear students, there is no difference between active and passive voice, but we do have some structural changes. We use active sentence when we think that the subject is important, we bring it in the beginning of the sentence, but in passive case, if the object is important to be highlighted, then we bring it in the beginning of the sentence. I hope you like my video. If you like it, please don't forget to subscribe my channel and press the bell icon to turn on the notification so that you can watch my more and more upcoming latest videos. And definitely these videos will enhance your knowledge. Thank you so much.